Michael Thompson was known across America as one of the most powerful businessmen of his time. Newspapers printed his picture almost every week. News channels spoke about his decisions, and magazines called him the billionaire who changed the world. He had built a company that touched millions of lives through technology, and his name had become a symbol of success. Yet behind all the power, Michael felt restless. His days were filled with meetings, numbers, and endless pressure. People treated him with respect, but he knew most of them were driven by fear or personal gain. It had been years since someone had spoken to him honestly, without expecting anything in return. One late evening, Michael's car drove him through the busy streets of New York City. His driver suggested a quiet restaurant nearby where he could eat without being surrounded by cameras or flashing lights. Michael agreed. He didn't want a fancy dinner that night. He just wanted peace. The car stopped in front of a small corner diner. Its neon sign flickered weakly, and through the glass windows Michael saw ordinary people eating burgers, sipping coffee, and laughing softly among themselves. It was the kind of place he hadn't stepped into in years. Michael entered the diner and the bell above the door jingled. For a moment the room went silent. Some people recognized him immediately. A few whispered his name, but most tried not to stare. Michael was used to that. He walked to a booth near the window and sat down, placing a thick folder on the table. The folder contained a contract, one that could change his company's future forever. Michelle Williams, a waitress at the diner, noticed him right away. Michelle was a hard-working woman in her 30s. She had smooth brown skin, tired but kind eyes, and an energy that made people feel welcome. She had been working at the diner for years, balancing long shifts to support her younger brother who was still in college. Life was not easy, but she carried herself with quiet strength. Walking over with a small notepad, Michelle greeted him with the same tone she used for everyone. "Good evening, sir. Coffee to start?" Michael looked up, and for the first time in a long while he saw someone not trying to impress him. No nervous smiles, no desperate attempts to make conversation about his wealth or company. Just a simple question. He gave a faint smile. "Yes, black coffee." "Thank you." Michelle nodded and went to pour his coffee. As she returned, she noticed the folder he carried. The bold letters on the first page caught her eye. It was the name of a company she had heard whispered about before. A company that people in her neighborhood spoke of with fear. Some families she knew had lost their savings because of its tricky deals. She had even overheard her neighbor crying once, saying that her husband's job had been taken away after the company closed one of its factories. Michelle placed the cup gently in front of Michael, but her eyes kept going back to the folder. Should she say something? She told herself it was none of her business. This man was a billionaire. He had lawyers, advisors, and teams of experts. Who was she, just a waitress to give him advice? But something inside her would not let her stay quiet. She had always believed that if you saw someone heading toward trouble, you should try to warn them. Whether they listened or not was their choice. Michael opened the folder and began reading through the pages. The diner around him buzzed with the soft clatter of dishes, the murmur of conversations, and the smell of frying onions. But Michelle could only focus on the papers in his hand. She hesitated, then leaned closer and whispered, "Sir." "Don't sign that," Michael froze. Slowly, he lifted his eyes from the contract and looked at her. Very few people in the world dared to interrupt him, let alone a waitress in a small diner. His voice was calm but sharp. "Excuse me?" Michelle's hands trembled slightly, but she held her ground. "I'm sorry. I know it's not my place, but I've heard about that company. People in my neighborhood, they lost everything because of them. They look honest, but they are not. Please, don't sign it." For a long moment, Michael simply studied her face. There was no hesitation in her tone, no hidden agenda in her eyes, just pure concern. He had spent decades surrounded by people who only told him what he wanted to hear. His executives flattered him. His investors pushed him. Even his closest advisors chose safe words. But here was a stranger, someone who had nothing to gain, telling him something no one else dared. Before he could respond, the door to the diner swung open. A tall man in a dark suit entered briskly. It was Robert Harris, Michael's top lawyer. He looked annoyed as he spotted Michael at the booth. "There you are," Robert said, striding over. "Michael, what are you doing here?" "We're running late." "That contract needs to be signed today." Robert glanced briefly at Michelle, then dismissed her presence with a cold look. We don't have time for distractions. The board is waiting. Michelle stepped back, her cheeks warming with embarrassment. Maybe she had gone too far. Maybe Michael would think she was foolish for speaking up. She bit her lip, ready to walk away. But Michael remained silent. His eyes lingered on Michelle as Robert continued speaking. This deal will secure the company's future. Billions are on the line. Let's not waste time. Michelle turned and walked back to the counter, pretending to busy herself with refilling salt shakers. Yet inside her heart pounded. She wished she hadn't spoken. But at the same time, a small voice inside her said she had done the right thing. Michael leaned back in the booth, his hand resting on the folder. Robert kept urging him to leave, but Michael wasn't listening. His thoughts returned again and again to the waitress's warning. She had spoken with a certainty that none of his advisors carried. For the first time in years, Michael felt unsure, not because of numbers, not because of profit margins, but because of a simple voice of truth from someone who had nothing to lose, and that moment planted a seed of doubt that would change everything. The rest of the evening in the diner moved slowly for Michelle. She tried to focus on her work, carrying plates of food and refilling cups, but her mind kept drifting back to the man in the booth by the window, Michael Thompson, a billionaire CEO. She never thought she would meet someone like him, and certainly not while she was wearing her work apron with her hair tied back in a bun. But what troubled her most was not his fame. It was the folder he carried, the contract she had warned him about. She wondered if he thought she was crazy. Most people in her place would have stayed silent. Maybe she had embarrassed herself. At the booth, Michael sat quietly with his untouched coffee. He was a man used to power and control. But the waitress's words lingered in his thoughts like an echo. Don't sign that. The tone of her voice had been serious, almost urgent, not the casual remark of a stranger trying to start a conversation. Robert Harris, his lawyer, stood nearby, impatiently tapping his phone screen. Michael, the board expects you in the office tonight. This deal has been in the works for months. If you delay, you'll risk losing everything we've prepared. Michael didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked across the diner where Michelle was placing plates on a table for an older couple. She laughed softly at something the woman said, and her tired eyes lit up for a brief second. She looked ordinary, yet in her simplicity there was a strength that unsettled him. Robert, Michael finally said, his voice calm. Do you know much about this company we're merging with? Robert gave a quick nod. Of course. I've read their reports. They've passed all the checks. Trust me, this is a golden opportunity. You'll double the empire. Michael's jaw tightened slightly. You're telling me everything is perfect? Robert leaned forward, lowering his voice. Yes, and we don't need to waste time second-guessing. Billion-dollar deals don't wait for hesitation. Sign it, and you'll go down in history as the man who made the boldest move in the decade. Michael looked down at the folder again. His instincts told him to move forward. After all, this was business, and Robert was known as one of the sharpest lawyers in the industry. But there was another voice now, softer yet stronger in his heart, the voice of the waitress. Michelle had no reason to interfere in his life. She was not an investor, not an advisor, not even an employee, and yet she had spoken with more conviction than the entire team of experts he had hired. Finally, Michael stood up. I'll think about it, Robert frowned. Think about it? Michael, hesitation costs money. We can't. Michael cut him off. Tomorrow, Robert. Tonight, I'm thinking. The lawyer clenched his jaw but nodded stiffly. Fine, but don't let a diner waitress get in your head. She doesn't know the first thing about billion-dollar deals. Michael didn't reply. He simply gathered the folder and walked out of the diner, leaving a generous tip on the table. Michelle noticed when he left, though she tried not to stare. She saw the tall lawyer follow him, looking frustrated. Something in her chest tightened. Had she really made any difference? Or had she only annoyed a powerful man? Later that night, when the diner grew quiet, Michelle's coworker Jennifer leaned on the counter and whispered, Was that really Michael Thompson? The billionaire? Michelle nodded slightly. Jennifer's eyes widened. And you actually talked to him? What did you say? Michelle hesitated, then smiled weakly. I told him not to sign something. Jennifer laughed softly. You? Giving advice to a billionaire? Then she grew serious. You should be careful, Michelle. People like him live in a different world. They don't want to hear what waitresses think. Michelle forced a small smile but said nothing. Deep down, she believed she had done the right thing. even if he never listened. The next morning, Michael sat in his penthouse office overlooking the city skyline. He placed the contract on his desk, but instead of signing, he opened his laptop and searched for independent reports on the company. What he found troubled him. Beneath the glowing press releases and polished reports were whispers. Old lawsuits, employees who had spoken out, families who had suffered. The information was scattered, buried deep in news archives, but it was there. Michael leaned back in his chair, his thoughts racing. He thought of Robert and how confidently he had pushed for the deal. He thought of his board, eager for profits. And then he thought of Michelle, the waitress who had nothing to gain by warning him. Her words came back to him again and again. "Please, don't sign it." Later that day, Michael entered the company's towering boardroom. The long glass table gleamed under bright lights, and around it sat his top executives. Everyone was waiting for him. The contract lay at the center, with golden pens placed neatly beside it. Robert was already standing. "Gentlemen, today is the day. Once Michael signs this, we step into a new era of success." The executives clapped politely. Michael walked to the table but did not sit down right away. He studied the faces of the men and women who had worked with him for years. They were confident, expectant. None of them showed doubt. He finally sat down and Robert pushed the contract toward him. "Michael, this is it. Sign here." Michael picked up the pen but did not move. He remembered Michelle's face, serious, almost pleading, as she whispered her warning. He remembered the stories of families losing everything because of this same company. His hand trembled slightly. "What do we really know about them?" he asked, his voice breaking the silence. The executives looked confused. Robert forced a smile. "We know everything we need to know. This deal has been checked, approved, and blessed. Trust the process." But Michael didn't feel trust. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of doubt pressing against his chest. He placed the pen back on the table. "I need more time," he said quietly. The room filled with murmurs. Robert's smile faded. "Michael, you can't be serious. This hesitation could cost us billions." Michael's voice was firm. "Better billions lost than a future destroyed." Everyone fell silent. Michael stood, leaving the pen where it was. He walked out of the room, his mind heavy but clear. That night, Michael's decision was the only thing the news channels could talk about. Analysts argued whether he had lost his nerve or whether he was being cautious. Investors panicked. Robert called him several times, urging him to reconsider, but Michael ignored the calls. He knew he had done the right thing by waiting, and deep inside, he knew exactly who had planted that doubt in his heart. The black waitress at a small diner who had dared to tell him, "Don't sign that." The boardroom remained heavy with silence long after Michael Thompson left. His decision not to sign had shocked everyone. The executives exchanged uneasy glances, and Robert Harris, his lawyer, clenched his fists in frustration. For months he had pushed for this deal, convinced it would secure his legacy as the man who guided the most powerful CEO in the country. Now all his plans hung in the balance. Michael, however, walked out of the towering building into the cool night air, feeling something he had not felt in years, uncertainty mixed with relief. His instincts told him he had avoided a trap, but his mind demanded proof. Billion-dollar contracts were not matters of simple feelings. Yet the voice of the diner waitress refused to leave his thoughts. That evening, instead of going to his penthouse, Michael instructed his driver to head somewhere else. "Take me back to that diner," he said quietly. The driver hesitated, surprised. "The diner from last night, sir?" "Yes." When Michael entered the diner again, the bell jingled above his head just like before. The same soft lights filled the room, and the familiar smell of frying food clung to the air. Michelle Williams was behind the counter refilling sugar jars. She looked up, startled when she saw him. "Mr. Thompson," she said, her voice uncertain. She quickly wiped her hands on her apron. "You're back." Michael nodded and walked to the same booth by the window. He placed the contract folder on the table but didn't open it. "Coffee, please," he said softly. Michelle brought him the cup, still confused why a billionaire would return to a simple diner 2 nights in a row. "Is everything all right?" she asked gently. Michael studied her face. She looked tired, but her eyes held honesty. "Do you know what you did last night?" he asked. Michelle's cheeks warmed. I probably embarrassed myself. I shouldn't have said anything. I know I'm just a waitress. It wasn't my place. Michael shook his head slowly. No, you gave me something I haven't had in a long time, truth. You didn't want anything from me. You just cared enough to warn me. That matters more than you know. Michelle's lips parted slightly, surprised by his words. But did it make any difference? Michael leaned back, holding the warm cup in his hands. Yes, today I walked into my boardroom ready to sign, but I remembered your warning. I stopped, and I may have saved my company from disaster. Michelle's eyes widened. She had spoken out of conscience, not expecting him to listen. Yet he had, and it had changed his decision. Before she could reply, Michael's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen. It was Robert. He ignored the call and sighed. My lawyer won't stop pushing. He insists I'm making a mistake by waiting. But I can't shake the feeling that you were right. Michelle hesitated before speaking. Sometimes people in power see only the numbers. They don't see the people those numbers hurt. In my neighborhood, numbers destroyed lives. That's why I said what I said. Michael listened carefully. He was a man who dealt with billions daily, but hearing the human cost in Michelle's voice gave him a perspective no report ever had. The next day, tension grew thicker inside Michael's company. The media was restless. Investors were calling nonstop, and employees whispered in hallways about the delay. Some thought Michael had lost his edge. Others believed he was protecting them. In the middle of the storm, Michael sat in his private office, staring at the city skyline. He called for a meeting with a trusted old friend, David Miller, who had once been an investigative journalist before joining Michael's company as an advisor. David, Michael said, sliding the folder across the desk, I need you to look into this company. Deep. Don't trust their reports. Don't trust the lawyers. I want the truth. David raised an eyebrow. What made you suspicious? Michael paused, then smiled faintly. A waitress. David chuckled, thinking it was a joke, but the seriousness in Michael's eyes stopped him. You're not joking. No, she spoke with conviction, and I trust conviction more than polished numbers. David nodded slowly. All right, I'll dig. But if she's right, this may be bigger than you think. While David began his investigation, Michael couldn't stop thinking about Michelle. He returned to the diner several times that week. At first, Michelle was nervous having him there, but she soon realized he wasn't coming for luxury or attention. He just wanted a quiet place and honest company. One evening, as Michelle poured him coffee, she asked, Why would a man like you listen to someone like me? Michael looked at her seriously. Because power is a cage. People tell me only what I want to hear, or what benefits them. You had no reason to speak up, but you did. That makes your words worth more than gold. Michelle was silent for a moment, touched by his honesty. She never imagined her simple warning would mean so much. Meanwhile, in the boardroom, Robert was losing patience. He called meeting after meeting, trying to convince the executives that Michael's hesitation was dangerous. He's letting emotions cloud his judgment, Robert argued. We're on the brink of history, and he's wasting time. But behind his sharp words, Robert's own fear was growing. If the deal collapsed, his reputation would crumble. He had been the loudest voice pushing for the merger. Late at night, Robert called Michael again. This time, Michael answered. Michael, listen to me, Robert said, his voice urgent. You're making a mistake. Every day you delay, we lose millions. Investors are growing restless. Do you want them to turn against you? Michael's voice was calm but steady. Robert, I asked you before, what do we really know about this company? Be honest, Robert hesitated. We know enough. They're profitable, their numbers check out. That's not what I asked, Michael interrupted. What do we really know? There was a long silence. Michael realized Robert had no true answer. He ended the call without another word. Days turned into a week, and then David returned with a thick report. He placed it on Michael's desk, his face serious. You were right to wait, David said. Or rather, your waitress was right. Michael opened the file, his eyes narrowing as he read. Hidden lawsuits. Factories shut down without warning. Families thrown into poverty. Promises made and broken. Layers of polished lies designed to trick even the smartest lawyers. If you had signed, David continued, within a year your company would have drowned in their debts. It would have destroyed everything you built. Michael leaned back, letting the weight of the truth sink in. Relief washed over him, mixed with anger at how close he had come to ruin. He thought again of Michelle, the waitress who had seen what his entire team had missed. That evening, Michael returned to the diner once more. Michelle was surprised to see him, but when she noticed the faint smile on his face, she knew something had changed. You were right, Michael said simply as he sat down. Michelle blinked. Right about what? The contract. The company, all of it. You saved me. Michelle laughed nervously. I didn't save you. I just spoke. Michael shook his head. No, you gave me the courage to stop and listen. That warning, it changed everything. For a moment, neither spoke. The diner hummed softly with the sounds of dishes clinking and quiet conversations. Yet in that small booth by the window, something powerful had taken root. Trust. And though Michelle did not know it yet, that trust would soon shake the walls of the most powerful boardrooms in the country. Michael Thompson had faced many challenges in his long career, but the past week felt different. He was not battling competitors, not struggling with market numbers, and not negotiating with world leaders. This time he was battling a truth that had been hidden behind polished contracts and smooth promises. And all of it had started with a single warning from a waitress in a small diner. When David Miller, his trusted advisor and former journalist, handed him the report, Michael had known instantly that life was about to change. The documents were thick, filled with evidence of fraud, lawsuits, and debts carefully disguised under false names. The company Robert Harris had insisted on merging with was not just unstable, it was dangerous. Michael sat in his office late at night, staring at the city lights that sparkled beyond his window. His empire stretched across the globe. His name carried weight in every corner of the business world, yet here he was, realizing that everything could have collapsed if he had signed his name without hesitation. For the first time in years, he felt grateful not to his lawyers, not to his board, but to someone who had spoken with honesty when no one else did. The next morning, Michael called for an emergency board meeting. The executives arrived in sharp suits, their expressions curious and slightly nervous. Everyone expected Michael to finally sign the contract after days of hesitation. Robert, especially, entered the room with a confident stride, carrying his own copy of the documents. But when Michael stepped into the boardroom, his expression was unreadable. He placed David's thick report on the glass table and looked around the room. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, his voice steady. Before we go any further with this deal, I want you to see something. He nodded to David, who connected a laptop to the large screen at the end of the room. The first slide appeared, headlines of lawsuits filed against the company they were preparing to merge with. Gasps filled the air. One executive leaned forward. Are these real? David nodded. Every one of them. Buried in small-town courts, settled quietly and never reported to investors. But the evidence is clear. Slide after slide revealed more. The sudden closure of factories that had left entire towns without jobs, promises made to employees and broken without warning, debts hidden behind shell accounts. Each page was a blow to the confidence that had once filled the room. Robert shifted uncomfortably, trying to keep his composure. This can't be accurate. These are isolated incidents. Every company has lawsuits. Michael's eyes narrowed. Isolated? Look again. This isn't one or two mistakes. This is a pattern, a design, a trap. Silence fell across the room. Some executives looked shocked, others angry, and a few stared at Robert with suspicion. Finally, one of the senior board members spoke. Michael, if this is true, signing this merger would have destroyed us. Michael nodded. Exactly. And I came within inches of making that mistake. But I didn't. And do you know why? The room waited. Michael's voice grew firmer. Because someone outside these walls had the courage to tell me what no one here did. A voice without power, without position, without profit. Just truth. The room fell into stunned silence. Michael let the words hang there, letting his executives realize that their wealth and titles had blinded them, while a simple warning from a diner waitress had opened his eyes. Robert's face had grown pale. He cleared his throat and spoke quickly. Michael, listen. You can't let outside noise guide your decisions. You've built this empire because you focus on facts, not rumors. If you back out now, you'll look weak in front of investors. This could damage your reputation. Michael turned sharply toward him. Weak, Robert, I call it strength. Strength is listening to truth, even when it's inconvenient. Strength is protecting thousands of employees instead of chasing profit blindly. Robert swallowed, realizing the ground beneath him was slipping. Michael continued, his voice firm and unshakable. From this day forward, I will not sign this contract. We will cut ties with this company completely, and we will investigate how such a dangerous deal got this far without being questioned. Murmurs erupted around the table. Some executives nodded in agreement, relieved they had been saved from disaster. Others shifted uneasily, realizing Michael's words meant someone among them had failed. Or worse, someone had tried to deceive him. After the meeting, the boardroom buzzed with whispers. Some praised Michael for his caution, others worried about investor backlash, but everyone knew one thing: the decision had saved them from ruin. Michael returned to his office, where David was waiting. "You did the right thing," David said quietly. Michael nodded, though his mind was still heavy. "Yes, but it was close, too close. If not for her?" His voice trailed off. David smiled knowingly. "The waitress?" Michael allowed himself a faint smile. "Yes, Michelle Williams. She saw the truth that none of us did. I owe her more than I can ever repay." That evening, while the business world buzzed with speculation, Michael once again returned to the diner. It was becoming a place of strange comfort for him, away from the glittering towers of wealth. Michelle was wiping down tables when he entered. She froze for a moment, then smiled nervously. "You're back again." Michael sat at the same booth. "I had to tell you something. You saved me. You saved my company." Michelle blinked, confused. I didn't do anything. I just told you not to sign." Michael leaned forward. "You did more than you think. Today I stood in front of my entire board, holding evidence of fraud that could have destroyed everything I built. I only found that evidence because of your warning." Michelle's eyes widened. She had imagined her words might have planted a seed, but she never dreamed they could change the future of one of the biggest companies in America. "Mr. Thompson," she said softly, "I didn't mean to interfere. I couldn't stay quiet. Too many people have suffered because of companies like that." Michael nodded slowly. "And that's why your words mattered. You weren't thinking of money or power. You were thinking of people. That's something too many in my world forget." Michelle lowered her eyes, touched by his sincerity. "I'm glad you listened." Over the next few days, news spread quickly. Reports leaked that Michael Thompson had backed away from a major merger. Journalists speculated endlessly, investors demanded answers, and rumors filled the business world. Some called Michael cautious, others called him foolish, but no one knew the truth, that the turning point had come from a quiet voice in a small diner. Inside his company, trust began to shift. Executives who had blindly followed numbers realized they had to be more careful. Employees whispered about their CEO's strange courage, refusing to be rushed into a bad deal. And Robert Harris? He grew more nervous with each passing day, because Michael had ordered a full internal investigation into how the fraudulent company had gotten so far in negotiations. And Robert's fingerprints were all over it. One evening, as Michael prepared to leave his office, David stepped in. "You know, you've started something, Michael. This isn't just about a contract anymore. You've shown everyone that honesty can come from anywhere, even a diner waitress. That's a story people won't forget." Michael looked out at the city skyline again, thoughtful. "Yes, but it's also a responsibility. If I ignore her courage, then I've learned nothing." David smiled. "So what will you do?" Michael turned back, his expression calm but determined. "I'll honor it. Not with words, but with actions." And with that decision, Michael prepared for the next step, a step that would not only expose the truth but also bring Michelle into a world she never imagined she would be part of. The boardroom was no longer the safe place it once had been for Robert Harris. The polished glass table, the tall leather chairs, and the impressive skyline view now felt like a stage where every eye studied him with suspicion. Michael Thompson's refusal to sign the contract had shaken the entire company, but the internal investigation that followed shook Robert even more. Every day, more files appeared on Michael's desk. Each file carried traces of Robert's involvement. Emails, phone records, sudden meetings with people from the fraudulent company. It was all there. He had been the loudest voice pushing the deal forward, promising quick profits and market dominance. But now those promises looked like traps. Michael sat quietly in his office one evening, reviewing the latest documents. David Miller, the former journalist turned advisor, stood beside him. "It's all connecting," David said softly. "Robert wasn't just careless, he knew. He had meetings with their executives months before he ever brought this deal to you." Michael leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. So he was working with them the whole time. David nodded. And if you had signed, the losses would have been enormous. The company might not have survived. Michael closed the file slowly. Then tomorrow the truth comes out. The next morning, Michael called another board meeting. Word had already spread through the building that something big was about to happen. Employees whispered in the halls, journalists waited outside the tower, and even investors kept calling in, demanding answers. When the executives gathered, Robert entered looking pale but still trying to keep his usual confidence. He adjusted his tie, forcing a smile, but his eyes darted nervously across the room. Michael began calmly. Thank you all for coming. Today we close this chapter of the merger, but before we move forward, you all deserve to know the full truth. He nodded to David, who once again prepared the screen. The first slide appeared. Emails between Robert and executives from the fraudulent company. Gasps filled the air. Michael spoke firmly. These are not rumors. These are verified communications. Robert Harris, a senior advisor of this company, worked privately to push us into a deal designed to collapse us. Robert shot up from his chair. That's not true. Those are taken out of context. Every executive has private talks before a deal. It's part of the process. David stepped forward. Then how do you explain the payments? The next slide appeared. Bank transfers to an account linked to Robert. Dates and amounts lined up perfectly with each major step of the deal. Whispers spread like wildfire around the table. Executives leaned closer, disbelief in their eyes. Robert's voice cracked. Those aren't mine. I don't know what you think you're proving. Michael cut him off, his voice cold. Enough, the evidence is clear. You didn't just fail your responsibility. You betrayed us. You tried to hand this company over to people who destroy lives for profit. Robert's face turned red, sweat forming at his forehead. He looked around the table for support, but none came. Even those who once praised him now avoided his eyes. For a long moment, the room was silent except for the hum of the projector. Finally, one board member spoke, her voice trembling with anger. Michael, what do we do now? Michael stood tall, his voice strong. We take action. Robert Harris is hereby removed from his position. Effective immediately. Security will escort him from the building. Gasps filled the air again. Robert slammed his hand on the table. You can't do this. You need votes, you need... But before he could finish, 2 security officers stepped inside. Michael didn't flinch. It's already done. Robert's face twisted with fury, but there was no way out. The once powerful advisor now looked small as the officers led him from the room. The heavy doors shut behind him and silence followed. Michael turned back to the board. Let this be a lesson. We don't build this company on greed. We build it on truth. And if truth has to come from the humblest places, then we will listen. The news spread within hours. Headlines filled every newspaper. Say how Michael Thompson exposes corruption in his own ranks. Merger canceled after fraud. Uncovered. Robert Harris removed amid scandal. Television networks replayed the dramatic board, meeting again and again, and commentators praised Michael's courage. Investors, instead of panicking, began to trust him more, realizing he had saved them from a disaster. But amid the chaos of fame and speculation, Michael thought of only one person, Michelle, the waitress whose words had started it all. That evening, Michael returned to the small diner once again. The neon sign buzzed softly. The smell of coffee drifted through the air, and Michelle stood behind the counter serving a couple of late customers. When she saw him walk in, her eyes widened in surprise. Mr. Thompson? Michael smiled faintly. Michael. Just call me Michael. She laughed nervously. What brings you here again? I thought billionaires only ate at fancy places. Michael shook his head. Not anymore. This diner has given me more than any fancy restaurant ever could. Michelle tilted her head. What do you mean? He sat down at a booth and she followed, still holding her order pad. You warned me, Michael said, and because of that I didn't sign. Today I exposed someone who tried to destroy my company. The world is talking about it, but none of them know the real reason why I stopped. Michelle blinked. Me? Michael nodded. Yes, you. If not for your honesty, I would have walked straight into that trap. You gave me something money can't buy, clarity. Michelle's cheeks flushed. She looked down at the table. I just told you what I felt. I didn't think it mattered. Michael leaned forward. It mattered more than you know, and I won't forget it. The diner was quiet that night with only a few customers scattered around. For the first time, Michelle saw Michael not as a billionaire CEO, but as a man carrying a heavy responsibility. His voice wasn't commanding, but humble. "Michelle," he said softly, "I've spent years surrounded by people who only tell me what I want to hear. You told me what I needed to hear. And because of that, thousands of jobs, thousands of families are safe." Michelle smiled gently. "I'm glad I could help." They sat in silence for a while, the hum of the diner filling the air. For Michael, the place felt like a safe harbor. For Michelle, it felt strange but comforting to know she had touched the life of someone so powerful. Meanwhile, across the city, Robert sat alone in his apartment, staring at the news on his television. His career was destroyed, his reputation shattered, and his future uncertain. Anger boiled inside him, but beneath the anger was fear. Because Robert knew something that Michael didn't yet, this wasn't over. The company he had partnered with wasn't going to let go so easily. There were bigger players involved, people who had invested too much to walk away quietly. And Robert, desperate to save himself, was already thinking of his next move. Back at the diner, Michael stood to leave. He looked at Michelle one last time and said, "The world may never know how much I owe you, but I do. And one day I'll make sure you're recognized for the courage you showed." Michelle smiled softly. "I don't need recognition, Michael. Just promise me one thing. Don't stop listening to people who tell you the truth, even if they have nothing to gain." Michael nodded firmly. "I promise." As he stepped out into the cool night air, the city lights shimmered in the distance. For the first time in years, Michael felt not just like a leader, but like a man guided by something greater than ambition, guided by truth. But deep inside, he knew the storm wasn't over. Robert's downfall was only the beginning, and somewhere out there, forces were already preparing their next strike. The days following Robert Harris's removal were intense. Michael Thompson's company had survived a major threat, but the world outside was still restless. Investors called nonstop, reporters crowded around the skyscraper, and social media buzzed with speculation about the mysterious decision to cancel the merger. Michael, however, focused on one thing: ensuring that his company, and the people who worked there, would remain safe. He had learned a powerful lesson over the past weeks. Truth could come from the most unexpected places, and courage could be found in the humblest of hearts. That courage had come from Michelle Williams, the waitress who had changed the course of his life. Her words, whispered in a small diner, had saved him from disaster, and now he wanted to honor her in a way that reflected the depth of her impact. Michael called a meeting, not with executives or advisors, but with the employees of his company. He wanted everyone to understand that the recent events were not just about numbers or contracts. They were about people, integrity, and the choices they made when no one was watching. On the day of the meeting, the company's large auditorium was filled with anticipation. Hundreds of employees gathered, whispering nervously. The news of Robert's removal had spread quickly, and while some employees were shocked, others were quietly proud that their CEO had acted with courage. Michael stepped onto the stage, his tall figure silhouetted by the lights. The room fell silent immediately. Cameras flashed from media teams who had been invited to witness the announcement. "Good morning," Michael began. His voice was calm but firm. "Over the past few weeks, our company faced a challenge like no other. We were close to making a decision that could have destroyed everything we built. And yet we were saved, not by numbers, not by lawyers, but by courage. By truth." He paused, scanning the room. "I want to introduce someone who changed the course of this company. Someone whose honesty and bravery remind us all of what truly matters." Michelle walked toward the stage, her heart pounding. She had been invited, but never imagined she would stand in front of hundreds of employees, let alone the media. Her hands trembled slightly, but her expression was calm. She had never sought recognition for her warning. She had only spoken because it was right. Michael smiled at her. "This is Michelle Williams. She works at a small diner in New York City. And her words, simple words, honest words, saved our company and the livelihoods of thousands of employees." The room erupted in applause. Employees stood cheering and clapping, some even whistling. Michelle's eyes filled with tears. She had never been acknowledged like this, and yet here she was, recognized by one of the most powerful men in the country, for her courage and integrity. Michael continued, his voice strong. From this day forward, Michelle will lead a new initiative in our company, our integrity division. Her role will be to ensure that honesty and transparency are at the heart of every decision we make, because it is courage and truth that safeguard us from failure, not just profits. Michelle was stunned. She had expected perhaps a small thank you, but this was beyond anything she had imagined. She swallowed hard, then nodded. "I'll do my best," she said softly, her voice steady despite the emotion she felt. Michael looked at the audience. "Let this be a lesson to all of us. Sometimes the most important advice comes from unexpected places. Sometimes the smallest voice can save the largest company. And sometimes doing the right thing is more important than any deal, any contract, or any profit." The crowd's applause intensified, echoing through the auditorium. Reporters hurried to capture the moment, broadcasting it live to millions across the country. The story of the black waitress who warned a billionaire CEO became a headline, inspiring people far beyond the walls of the company. Back in the boardroom, David Miller watched the event unfold on a monitor. "Michael, this is incredible," he said. "You've shown everyone that courage and integrity are as valuable as strategy and capital." Michael nodded. "It's more than that. It's about respect for truth, for people, for life." Michelle reminded me of what I had forgotten in all these years of business, that every decision we make affects real lives. "And we are responsible for those lives," David smiled. "And you've given her the platform to make a difference on a much larger scale." "She's extraordinary." Michael leaned back in his chair. "No, she's ordinary. Just honest. And that's the point. Ordinary people with courage can change extraordinary things." The next weeks were filled with transformation. Michelle began her work leading the integrity division. She implemented simple yet effective policies to ensure transparency, fairness, and ethical decision-making. Employees admired her, not just because she was the CEO's appointed leader, but because she had demonstrated what honesty could achieve. Michael, meanwhile, continued to oversee the company, but with a renewed sense of purpose. He consulted Michelle regularly, valuing her input more than ever before. Each time she spoke, he remembered the day she whispered those life-changing words in a small diner. "Don't sign that." And while the world outside speculated about the company's future, inside, a quiet revolution of truth and integrity was taking place. One evening, after a long day of meetings, Michael returned to the diner. It had become a personal tradition, a reminder of humility, courage, and the power of a single voice. Michelle greeted him warmly. "You've been busy," she said, handing him a cup of coffee. "I have," Michael admitted, smiling, "but I wanted to come here tonight to say thank you again, and to remind myself where it all began." Michelle chuckled softly. "I can't believe I'm part of all this now. Me, a simple waitress." Michael shook his head. "No, you're the heart of it. You reminded me that no matter how powerful we think we are, truth always matters more." They sat together quietly for a moment, sipping coffee. Outside, the neon sign flickered, the sounds of the city drifting through the open windows. For Michael, this diner was no longer just a place for food. It was a symbol of courage, integrity, and unexpected change. Back at the headquarters, the company continued to thrive. Employees worked with renewed energy, investors gained confidence, and the media hailed Michael's leadership as a model for corporate responsibility. But no matter the accolades or headlines, Michael never forgot Michelle. Months later, during the company's annual gathering, Michael invited Michelle to the stage once again. This time it was to recognize her formally in front of every employee and executive. "Today," Michael said, "we honor someone whose courage and honesty have become the foundation of our company's future. Michelle Williams, you have shown us that integrity is priceless. You have reminded us that even the smallest voice can make the loudest impact." The room erupted. Applause, cheers, and even tears filled the auditorium. Michelle covered her face, overwhelmed by the love and admiration surrounding her. Employees stood clapping, some shouting her name. Cameras flashed, capturing the unforgettable moment. Michael smiled proudly. "Michelle, thank you for reminding us what matters most." Michelle whispered, almost to herself, "I just spoke the truth." "And that," Michael said, "is more powerful than anything else in the world." As the celebration continued, Michael watched the crowd, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. The journey from the small diner to the grand stage had been extraordinary, but it wasn't about fame, wealth, or power. It was about courage, truth, and the choices we make when faced with challenges. And in that moment, Michael realized that a company could survive almost any storm, but only if it listened to the voices of truth, even when they came from the most unexpected places. Michelle's presence reminded everyone in the room that heroes did not always wear suits, titles, or carry prestige. Sometimes heroes were ordinary people who dared to speak honestly, even when it seemed impossible. The room exploded, not just with applause, but with hope. Hope that honesty could prevail, that courage could change lives, and that even the smallest voice could have the power to alter the course of history. And Michael Thompson, Billionaire CEO, knew that the world would never forget the black waitress who had whispered one simple phrase: "Don't sign that." Because in those 4 words, the fate of a company, the lives of thousands, and the course of history had been saved.